webinar on teacher education for disability inclusion, which is jointly presented by the Including Disability in Education in Africa IDEA Research Unit at the University of Cape Town and the Department of Higher Education and Training within the Teacher Education Directorate. We've been surprised and delighted to have such a positive response to this invitation, and this indicates to us the importance of this topic for education in South Africa. But before we continue, just one important housekeeping rule that I want to check with you. If you are making use of our sign language interpreters, Beryl Buerta and Michelle Lombard, they will alternate during the webinar, and in order to view the sign language interpreter in the meeting, you'll need to find their video, then right-click on the video and select Pin. And when they've been pinned, you will be able to see them in large view. So just to make sure that we have that under control, and then you are aware of the conventions about keeping your camera and microphone off and using the chat feature or raised hand to ask questions. So that brings us then to today and the purpose of today. And I think the purpose of today is that the continued exclusion of children with disabilities from education must be addressed. Sustainable Development Goal 4 aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities promotes the inclusion of all children in states' education systems and stresses the need for reasonable accommodation within inclusive settings. In South Africa, within Education White Paper 6, inclusive education is promoted as the route to disability inclusion. Of course, critical to the success of inclusive education, and indeed to inclusive, equitable and quality education for all children, is the necessity for relevant teacher education. And it is this that drives our meeting here today. And I would just like to set the background of the developments that have led to this particular meeting. And we will hear much more about that during the course of the day. The Teaching and Learning Development Capacity Improvement Program within the DHET is a partnership within the South African European Union Strategic Partnership and focuses on strengthening university capacity for the preparation of ECD educators, primary school teachers, teachers for inclusive and special needs education, TVET college lecturers, community education and training college lecturers, and university teaching. However, the focus today is on the Teacher Education for Inclusive Teaching, the TEFIT project within this initiative, which aims to strengthen university capacity for inclusive and special needs teacher education. Then, complementary to this DET process, the European Union allocated funding to civil society and universities to support them in the teacher strengthening. And the Teacher Empowerment for Disability Inclusion, the TEDI project, was one of 4 projects arising from this call. And one of the aims of that project was to conduct research on the needs of children with severe hearing, visual and intellectual impairments and the teacher education to meet these needs. So the meeting today comes from, in some sense, from that project and the focus being on those particular children. On the basis of the TEDI research, we developed short courses to build educator capacity. And by carefully evaluating this process, we were able to draw on these lessons for informing teacher education for children with what we call, for want of a better term, severe to profound disabilities in South Africa. And we have then synthesized these into policy briefs. When the TEDI project closed in August 2020, IDEA continued the discussion with DHET, and we agreed it would be beneficial to open this discussion to a much wider audience, as we have done today. And I'm excited to welcome you to a robust discussion with a range of stakeholders present. So I think we are very fortunate to have the support of the European Union again. And given the instrumental role that the European Union has played in this process, I think it's very fitting that we should ask Mr. Bernard Ray, Head of Cooperation, Delegation of European Union, South Africa, to open the meeting for us. And as a brief introduction, Bernard Ray was born in France and is a doctor of veterinary medicine by training. And he holds a master's degree in economics of development. He started his career in institutions in Mexico, the Netherlands, and Ethiopia. He subsequently joined the European Catholic Union in Nigeria, Kenya, and Madagascar. And he was in charge of the EU rural development and agricultural portfolios in these countries. He was the head of development cooperation of the EU in Kenya between 2009 and 2012 until he was appointed in the leadership of the Food Security and Agriculture Policy Department of the Euro Cooperation and Development. Since September 2018, he serves as head cooperation of the EU in South Africa. We are very honored by his presence here today and grateful for the support that we have received from the delegation over the years. Please, may I introduce Mr. Ray to open our meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. I hope you hear me well and can see me.
Yes.
Can you?
We can.
Yes. All right. Good. Excellent. Representatives of the departments of higher education and training and basic education. It's really a great audience that you have gathered. Professors, academics, representatives of universities, schools, think tanks, civil society organizations, as well as institutions on inclusive education. Really, it's an impressive audience that I looked a little bit at the list. And it's therefore a great pleasure to say a few words at the opening of this special webinar. Focusing, as you mentioned, on disability inclusion in teacher education and development in South Africa. I'll probably dwell on 3 points. First, the context overall of the involvement of the European Union, inclusive education as an issue, and some perspectives from the European Union and what we do in Europe. Clearly, education plays a pivotal role in helping to build an inclusive and tolerant societies, and also in equipping young people with the skills they need to be resilient and socially engaged citizens. Education features prominently in the development cooperation strategy of the European Union with South Africa. It's too important. And we are very pleased that many of our collaborators and good friends are here today. The college Department of Higher Education, as I mentioned, University of Cape Town, and the 3 centers of excellence, WITS, Pretoria, and University of Johannesburg. This first webinar is part of DHET Teacher Education for Inclusive Teaching project. And it's an important component of the program we financed, the Teaching and Learning Development Program. So a joint interest in teachers. And we are very pleased by the involvement and indeed the co-hosting of the webinar by the University of Cape Town, this new Including Disabilities in Education in Africa unit idea. And I am certain that many of you appreciate that the unit has evolved from a project which was also financed by the EU involving the University of Cape Town and a German NGO, the Teacher Empowerment for Disability Inclusion. As was mentioned by Judith, part of the funding of the Teaching and Learning Development Program of the European Union was devoted to promote partnership with civil society and with academic institutions to strengthen teacher training for inclusive and special needs education. This unit and today's webinar is seen, or it can be really seen as a celebration of successful and sustainable interventions to promote inclusive education in Africa. It's a contribution important to SDG 4, as was mentioned, and particularly some of the indicators or sub SDG indicators, the one on eliminating all discriminations, the one on ensuring all learners acquire knowledge and skills. And it's also, and that's interesting, a particular indicator, a commitment to substantially increase the supply of qualified teachers as an international commitment under the Sustainable Development Agenda. So it's really a warm word of congratulations to all of you involved, and we hope it grows from strength to strength. Maybe at this stage, useful to say a few words about the right to education. We are today more and more following a rights-based approach. And there is no doubt that quality education for all is an imperative for the sustainable development of South Africa. Quality education is intrinsically linked to skills development, employability, and economic growth. Quality education is therefore an elevator towards transformation and a society which is more equal, more cohesive. Quality education is an investment towards social justice, and quality education for all means is really a traduction of leaving no one behind, which is our common objective. Quality education requires appropriate strategies to be developed and implemented for teachers to become inclusive teachers who can assist each child to reach his or her own potential, regardless of barriers to learning. Barriers to learning may exist in terms of physical, intellectual disability, as well as poverty, knowledge of languages, trauma. They can be combined, they can be permanent or transitory. Inclusive education looks at the potential instead of looking at the barriers, and puts mechanisms in place to overcome these barriers. The true enablers of inclusive education are the teachers. And I wish to pay a tribute to all the teachers present in this webinar and the thousands out there who were severely challenged by the circumstances in 2020, but nonetheless continued their commitments to inclusive education. Looking for a few words at Europe. The European Union recognizes the paramount importance of teachers as well. In November 2017, all EU member states ministers of education reaffirmed the need to invest in teachers and in school leaders as powerful determinants of student achievements. Let me quote, "High quality, motivated, and valued teachers are at the heart of excellent education." This, of course, applies to South Africa. With regards to special needs, there is a European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education has been set. It does critical work to advance this agenda and is increasingly relevant in the European context, with Europe being confronted with the need to accommodate children from very diverse education and cultural backgrounds. They need to be integrated into schools at different ages, and often these children have had not access to education for prolonged period of time, a challenge for both the students as well as the teaching staff. The EU believes that the quality of teacher education requires attention. Initial teacher education is more effective when pedagogical theory is combined with subject knowledge and sufficient classroom practice. Continued professional development needs to be accessible, affordable, and relevant. Involving schools and teachers in identifying themes and areas of need can help improve its quality. In Europe, debates, webinars, policy development, teacher education programs, and partnership between a broad range of education stakeholders and contributors are critical to enable disability inclusion in teacher education. With regards to ambition of IDEA, clearly South African universities have the resources, the knowledge, the skills to collaborate with other higher education institutions globally, and in particular regionally and on the continent. We also see that in the successful participation of the South African universities in the Erasmus Plus program. We would therefore strongly support IDEA's primary objective to act as a hub for future research in inclusive education in Africa and beyond, to promote networking and to carry out training within this field. The work undertaken here today can be catalytic to further ideas and knowledge, as well as promote and strengthen the area of inclusive education locally, from local to global. Let me end my remark, which have been already long, by thanking you all for this opportunity to say a few words at the start of this webinar. I wish you well for your deliberations and future work on inclusion of disability in teacher education. The work you do changes the lives of children. This is a most worthy and noble cause, and I salute you for your commendable efforts. And thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a good day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray, for those very encouraging words and for your support throughout this whole process. Your insightful input and encouraging words, your emphasis on the right to education that must include children with disability has been very helpful to us. I'd also like to point out, you mentioned the European Association of Special Needs Education. I think that's EASNI, and it's a source that we do look to in our work, and we have found that useful as well. We remain grateful to the EU for the support for disability inclusion in education, and we believe now that we have a good foundation and a dynamic network that we can build upon, making it sustainable and supporting our region and other African countries, as you have indicated in your introduction. Thank you for your confidence in the IDEA Research Unit, and I hope that we will be able to begin doing some of those activities that you have indicated. Thank you very much.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's much appreciated. So after that introduction, I'm just going to begin this webinar as we move into our second session, which is the opening address, disability inclusion in teacher education and development. And I'm just going to begin this by raising some questions about how we understand disability in relation to teacher education. And then I'm going to call upon my colleague, Dr. Danielle Cowley, to share with us her experiences of 2 teacher education programs in the USA that are directly dealing with these issues. If you'll just give me a moment, I'm just going to share my screen. And, you know, it's easy to do when you don't have a whole lot of people in the room, but when you have a whole lot of people in the room, all of a sudden, you're not able to do these things. So please just give me a minute to get this right. As predicted. Is that screen being shared? Can you give me some indication if that screen is being shared?
Yes, we can see it.
Thanks very much.
On PowerPoint, Judith.
There you
We
go.
can see. Thank you.
Good. Okay, great. Thanks for that feedback. So I'm just doing this as a very introductory piece, just really as a provocation, I think, to get people to think a little bit more about what we're actually doing here. And we've called this workshop after some deliberation. We called it Disability Inclusion in Teacher Education and Development in South Africa. So why the name? Why disability inclusion? Why do we call it that? And I think that this arises from two issues. And the first one is that inclusive education is not only about disability. And the second issue is that inclusive education is also about disability. So I think what we have here is a question of emphasis and which one we emphasize at which particular time. And I'm going to just unpack each of those points a little bit and to lead us into the discussion. So to begin with, inclusive education is not only about disability. There is sometimes the understanding that if we're talking about disability in education, we're talking about inclusive education. And if we're talking about inclusive education, we're talking about disability. But it's much broader than that. So I am quoting here from the Global Education Monitoring Report, and I quote from the chair of the advisory board, Helen Clark, in their recent 2020 report, Inclusive Education, All Means All. And Helen Clark has this to say: there are dilemmas and tensions involved in reaching the ideal of full inclusion. Moving from where we are now to having systems which cater for every learner's needs, including those with severe disabilities, is difficult. In full recognition of these challenges, though, the report, that is the GEM report, asks whether it is really necessary to seek justifications for inclusive education to be pursued. The report notes that debating the benefits of inclusive education can be seen as tantamount to debating the benefits of the abolition of slavery, or indeed of apartheid. This is a very strong way of putting it, that we are on the path to inclusion, that it is a process and that it is not easy and that it doesn't happen quickly. But we should not be having the debate still going on about whether it's the right thing to do. The report argues strongly for the moral imperative towards inclusion. So that's the one aspect where we see that it's not only about disability, but we also note that individuals are marginalized on the basis of gender, remoteness, wealth, ethnicity, language, migration, displacement, incarceration, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, religion, and so forth. And they are denied the right to experience an education of the same quality as their peers on the basis of this. And this, of course, has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which disproportionately affects marginalized groups. So inclusive education is not only about disability, it's about a much broader issue, which is marginalization and equal access to quality education. However, when we look at inclusive education, it is also about disability. There are particular and specific issues that need to be faced when dealing with disability in inclusive education. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is very explicit in Article 24 about an inclusive education system that provides an overall welcoming system, but at the same time provides specific supports. And in concern over this not being implemented to the extent that they'd hoped for, there was a general comment that was released in 2016, which was very explicit about how disability inclusion should be proceeding. So whereas overall, inclusive education is a process of systemic reform embodying changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers, with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. So that is the general ethos of inclusive education. However, the comment then goes on to say that placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without accompanying structural changes to, for example, organizing teaching and learning strategies does not constitute inclusion. And I think this is our the issue that we need to look at today, and we need to confront is, are we meeting, and how will we be meeting the needs of disabled students within an inclusive education system, with our special focus on teacher education. So what that can be pinned down to is, and I find it useful to think of, is dilemmas of difference. And here we have the dilemma that are the stigma and unequal treatment encountered by children with disabilities, is this better remedied by separation, where they can presumably get the very specific services that they presumably require, or by integration of this group with others? So either remedy risks reinforcing the stigma associated with assigned difference by either ignoring it or focusing on it possibly exclusively and to the exclusion of other important aspects. Bram Norwich, who works a lot in this field, puts it this way: in addressing inclusion in education as a question of how students with disabilities should be taught, there is this potential tension between the desirable goals of maximizing interaction with others, as all children under the same roof, and fulfilling learning potential wherever students learn best. I would, however, consider, I think we are, that phrases it very much in a question of which place education takes place. But I think we're moving away from that and looking at how do we fulfill learning potential. So then if we just move quickly to the South African context, and we have adopted a very broad definition of inclusion. And South African teacher education policy is headed toward ignoring disability. We know that a lot of specific programs teacher education programs were closed in the euphoria that came around inclusive education. And that these have, we have very limited disability in education training. In the South African context, there is a danger that segregation can get reproduced in a different guise when high support needs become equated with disability and equated with special schools. And I believe that those of you in the room will have encountered this, that there is a conflation between high support needs and disability, leading to special schools. So that is really just replicating the whole thing all over again. And here I would just like to make a word of caution on special schools, and I'm not in the position of arguing inclusion in special schools. That is not at all my position. My position and that of our unit is really quality education. But I want to caution this idea that teachers and teacher educators in the mainstream have around special schools, saying that their needs are better catered for in special schools. And I think this really needs examination. We need to know, are the needs really catered for better? And if we look at the status of teacher education, we cannot always say that the teachers in special schools are properly trained to meet the needs. So there needs to be work done in that domain. And finally, just before moving on to our next speaker, I want to emphasize as we go through today that the education of children with disabilities does not lie with a small group of specialists, but with all of us, if we are to take up what Mr. Ray has been talking to us about, the right of education for all children. We will not achieve that unless we all take some responsibility for the education of children with disabilities. So I will stop sharing there, and then let me just introduce our colleague Danielle. So I'll now introduce Dr. Cowley, who I hope at this stage is sound asleep in her bed in Northern Iowa, and she's not able to, the time difference is such that it's the middle of the night there, but she has kindly agreed to pre-record this presentation on her experiences of disability inclusion in teacher education at 2 universities in the USA. Danielle is an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Northern Iowa. Her primary teaching responsibilities include undergraduate teacher preparation courses in the area of positive behavioral supports, inclusive instruction for students with significant disabilities, differentiated instruction, and best practices for inclusion. Dr. Cowley's research interests include inclusive education, disability studies in education, urban school reform, and culturally responsive transition programming. She was the recipient of the 2014 American Educational Research Association sponsored Disability Studies in Education Outstanding Dissertation Award for her research on adolescent girls with disabilities. And she has received numerous awards for her teaching excellence at the University of Northern Iowa. She currently collaborates with myself on a disability studies coursework at the University of Cape Town. Belinda, please can you share the recording with us? And then if you have any questions for Dr. Carly, please make a note of them and she will join us live later in the day where she will address these questions. And then if I can ask you, Michelle Matthew, to take up the chair at the end of this presentation by Danielle Carly. Thanks very much.
So hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Danielle Cowley. I'm an associate professor at the University of Northern Iowa, and I'm very excited to be somewhat present with you all today, even if it is just for a video recording. So again, thank you all for inviting me today to speak to a few of my experiences with inclusive teacher preparation. Today, I will share with you some curriculum from two programs, one from the University of Northern Iowa, where all of our special educators are general educators first, and all of our general educators receive coursework related to disability and special education. The second example explores true inclusive teacher prep at Syracuse University, where all elementary education pre-service teachers are inclusive education majors. I plan to go quite specific when sharing examples from these programs, perhaps a bit too specific for an opening address. However, the question I am always asked in all things inclusion is how. So I'm hopeful that folks may leave today with some tangible ideas for instructing our general education counterparts in the ways of inclusive education. Special education at the University of Northern Iowa is decidedly not a major, but a minor course of study. Our department was intentional with this choice because we believe all students are general education students first. Thereby, their teachers should be as well. If special education were a standalone major, our students would not leave with licensure in general education. They would be missing out on very important methodological and content-specific coursework. So instead, our special education pre-service teachers graduate from UNI with a license in general education plus an endorsement in special education. One curricular change, however, we are considering is to offer an inclusive certificate for folks who aren't interested or able to complete the full special education minor. We feel this would be a nice first step toward a more inclusive teacher prep program. At this time, all general education majors are required to take one course specific to teaching students with disabilities, while additional content related to disability, inclusion, and special education is instructionally embedded into other courses such as Schools in American Society and Human Relations. My colleagues and I find it helpful to organize our teaching of general educators according to four major thought buckets, so to speak: constructions of social difference, historical contexts of difference, inclusive pedagogies, and disability-specific instructional adaptations. So let's take a look at the course that provides our general education majors with the most significant content related to schooling and students with disabilities. SPED 3150, Meeting the Needs of Diverse Learners. I currently teach this course, and the majority of my students are actually not minoring in special education, although I do try to coax them over. My students are also mostly secondary education majors. So I have folks across the array of content expertise, ranging from art education to social sciences, to music to chemistry teaching. The course begins by exploring frameworks for understanding disability, such as the social model of disability, where disability itself is not the major barrier to overcome, but instead the focus shifts to addressing social barriers, such as environments, attitudes, and discrimination. We also explore disability rights and history, focusing on eugenics, institutionalization, civil rights movements, and legal contexts related to disability. All in all, the course is grounded in an intersectional approach to disability, and the first-person lived experiences of disabled folks really drive our theoretical and historical foundations. For example, all of our students read Jonathan Mooney's The Short Bus in a book club style format throughout the beginning of this semester. So once this foundation is in place, students broadly explore many pedagogical approaches that are inclusive in nature and benefit all students, disabled or not. Universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, co-teaching and collaboration, restorative justice practices, and humanistic understandings of behavior. And because we have such excellent general education faculty who seek out opportunities to connect with special education faculty and recognize disability as diversity, UDL and differentiation are often familiar, at least somewhat, to these students. However, then we move into more special education specific content, such as assistive technology. Students get very excited for this content. It's often their first time exploring the material, and so they have many questions. We examine AT that supports reading, writing, communication, math, really all of it. And they work through low-tech options like a picture communication board with core vocabulary, to high-tech options like co-writer, which can turn students' spoken storytelling into typed writing. And while I do not expect to turn my general education majors into AT experts overnight, I am able to plant an inclusive bug in their ear by opening their eyes to technology that is very much new to them. Then we move on to more adaptations across the curriculum. This part of the course gets really fun because the students see much application to their own future practice. The theoretical and attitudinal foundations are key in actually implementing these practices. And with that foundation, students are very much on board to try out these pedagogical tools such as anchor charts, graphic organizers, movements, manipulatives, talking calculators, all in their own teaching. They start to see the benefit of a diverse approach to instruction, not only for students with disabilities, but for all children. We then conclude the semester with a very specific look into educational access by using a comprehensive literacy framework to demonstrate the potentials for inclusive teaching in action. While we do not have the time or the credit hours in this course, we do within our special education minor, to go into great depth of literacy access for students with disabilities, I use a model of instruction developed by Karen Erickson and David Copenhaver that situates all children as readers and writers. It moves beyond a more functional approach to literacy, particularly for students with significant disabilities, and recognizes that language, all its varied forms of communication, sign language, eye gaze, Braille, AAC, it recognizes that language as literacy. So things that we do, we discuss and analyze videos of children using alternative pencils, like those pictured here, as a means for students with complex communication needs to choose letters for producing writing. We also explore adapted books from the Tar Heel Reader, which rely greatly on core vocabulary and very simplified text to support our emerging readers. While we also review decodable texts that can help our more conventional readers move along in the general education curriculum. My favorite part of this instruction is how we're able to explicitly demonstrate how children, even with the most significant disabilities, are able to access literacy in the general education classroom and meaningfully participate alongside their non-disabled peers. I'm very intentional when delivering this content, as I hope to create inclusive sparks of acceptance where these pre-service teachers leave me thinking, well, of course students with disabilities can and should be in my classroom. Look at all of these things that I can do. Look at this adapted book I can give my student. Or look at this new and interesting way to write words. I can definitely collaborate with other teachers and include these kids in my classroom. So I'll end by saying that Syracuse University, which is my doctoral alma mater, takes a very similar approach to disability or special education specific content they deliver to their pre-service teachers. However, their program is fully inclusive. The content I've described is not just in 1 to 2 courses, but grounds all of their coursework. Thinking specifically here of the inclusive elementary program that I was a part of, there are no general education majors or special education majors, but all pre-service teachers are only inclusive education majors. So what happens is they leave dually certified to teach both special education and general education. Special education content is embedded throughout all of their courses, and faculty co-teach in inclusive ways. In addition, field placements may be general education in content, such as social studies, taught only in inclusive classrooms. I'm hopeful that you and I will move in a similar direction in the future. So thank you all for having me, and if there are any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time.
I say thank you to Danielle, who is not here with us, but in her absence, and hopefully we will see her later. We will now move into the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Michelle Matthey, Director Teacher Education at in the Department of Higher Education and Training. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that introduction. Before I start with our panel discussion, I'm sure you wouldn't mind if I thank Professor Cowley for a really interesting presentation on pre-service teacher education. I find it fascinating, in fact, when she talks about fully inclusive teacher education programs, where special needs or disability is embedded in every facet of the particular program and qualification itself. So it's certainly something for us to think about in our higher education institutions. But I also think that it's very fitting that that preceded this particular panel discussion, which is particularly looking at the issue of the quality, the knowledge and the skills of teachers in teacher education universities, particularly in terms of special needs or disability education, because as we all know by now, the white paper itself does acknowledge that the education of our most vulnerable children, who are actually those who have special needs, is characterized by a cadre of teachers that do not have the relevant expertise in order to ensure quality education for these children. And so I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists who come from higher education institutions, all of them within their own speciality areas, which I will describe now. So firstly, our first panelist is Nikki Pasquale, and Nikki is working on a very exciting program in the disability unit at UCT. She'll speak more about that later. Nikki is the interim convener for that particular program. Professor Claudine Storbeck is the director of the Center for Excellence in Deaf Studies. Dr. Ray spoke about these, and this is one of the centers that the DHET and the European Union have partnered in order to ensure that it is established as a specialized center that will be able to assist any stakeholders, irrespective of organization, with the materials that are developed, with short learning courses, etc. And of course, the materials are all available as free access. The third panelist is Dr. Jean Fourie, who is from the University of Johannesburg, and she works and has led the project on the establishment of the Center for Neurodevelopmental Learning Needs. And finally, we have Professor Ronel Storbeck from University of Pretoria, who's done leading work and research in the field of visual impairment studies, and in fact is working closely with the Faculty of Education to ensure that the Center for Visual Studies can be sustainable and can be viable and also available for stakeholders who would wish to explore visual impairment studies further with her. I have 4 questions for the panelists. I do hope that the participants in the webinar will be able to use the chat and ask some questions or make some comments as the panelists go through their presentations. We do have 10 minutes at the end of the session for me to choose about 3 questions that I will then pose to our panelists to answer. So let's go directly into the questions. And my first one is in relation to Dr. Ray's comment, and I think his appreciation of the passion and the commitment of everyone at this webinar in terms of working in disability and inclusion across our country. And that's the reason why I think, panelists, it's important for us to understand why you've actually chosen this particular area of disability education that you will be speaking about, and what are the distinguishing features and scope of your work. We'll start with Nikki. Nikki?
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Michelle. Yes, I have been working for a long time out of South Africa, and coming back to this country, I really needed to find what I'm passionate about, and I'm quite passionate about empowering the community. So I'm involved in a program that really builds capacity and equips community workers across various communities, but specifically within the Western Cape region. And this program has been developed over a few years. It's the Higher Certificate in Disability Practice, which we train and equip any cadre of community worker, caregiver, mothers of disabled children, unemployed youth, students at TVET colleges that are seeking to upskill themselves, and it really builds capacity and empowers communities and brings inclusion into the community perspective. And I felt that this is really important to be a part of, coming back to South Africa after so many years, and it's exciting. It really excites me, and I'm passionate about strengthening that voice of our community to empower themselves to be inclusive socially, to I'm getting excited, but that's what our work is about. So thank you. I'll hand it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nikki. I think it's that excitement that really energizes you and gets you to do the fantastic things that you are doing within the community. I think in two ways, the higher certificate is really important. First of all, it actually allows students to articulate into tertiary professional programs at the tertiary education institutions. And secondly, I'm really excited about the fact that you work within the community. I'm sure we are all familiar with stories and hearsay and narratives around children with disabilities who are hidden away from members of the communities because the parents in some way or the other feel that it's a kind of secret, a kind of taboo. So I'm hoping, Nikki, that through your work with the community health workers and the other members of communities, that this will no longer be an issue for our children with disabilities. Thank you, Nikki, for that. Professor Storbeck, Claudine, we move on to you. Claudine is another very passionate member of this whole disability, but she's particularly passionate about education for the deaf. Thank you, Claudine.
Thanks, Michelle. And, you know, thanks to the funding from the EU, because the Centre for Deaf started at BITS about 22, 23 years ago, putting in foundations in place because deafness is invisible. And so it really touched my heart that this deaf community, who really are not a disability community, but a community of language and cultural minority group, was being ignored and marginalized. And then through this beautiful process in South Africa of going through democracy and language equality, deafness is still part of the apartheid marginalized community because the language and the culture is still very much not recognized. And so, you know, having this foundation in place was important. But with the funding from the EU, in partnership with the Department of Higher Education, we were able to explode it and really give it what we were never able to give it in nations. And so we have a training program that was established. We do research. And the material development has been crucial. So if they can put on the PowerPoint slide with the materials that we've developed with this funding, that would be wonderful. But the main thing is this is an invisible group, and we're wanting to work with teachers at the grassroots level, trainers, working with deaf adults going forward in entrepreneurship, and now we've started working with deaf babies and families. And so the Centre for Deaf Studies is really becoming a cradle-to-grave service, we hope.
Thank you so much for that, Claudine. Cradle to grave, that's amazing. I also particularly like what you said about language, the language of the deaf. And you also spoke once in our interactions with the EU project around the culture of the deaf. And I think that is something that you could possibly speak about when we have our response session, if you could think about that in the meantime. Thank you, Claudine. Professor Ferreira Ronel from the University of Pretoria. I think that your slide is coming up now, Claudine.
So as soon as I can see it, I shall talk about it.
All right, I see it. Before we go to you, Ronel, let's just finish off with Claudine's slide.
So just go to the next slide, please. And so with the funding that we received from the EU in partnership with the DHET, we were able to create materials that teachers of the deaf can use in the classroom. So these books are really having deaf storytelling characters in books for children of the highest quality. Next slide, please. And then worksheets and activities that teachers can use with these stories in the class, in both the maths class, the English class, all of them. And so these characters are deaf, and then we've got information inside that tell teachers about how to develop language, thinking skills, and deaf children get to see people just like themselves in the book with hearing aids. And then we've got poetry books about deaf heroes, and books that are workbooks for teachers on sign language games, etc. So they're free online thanks to the support. Anyone can download it forever and ever. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Claudine. Interesting resources for anyone to download and print and use as they see fit. Ronelle, we're back with you.
Good morning, Michelle. Thank you very much for the introduction. If I think of my research broadly, I'd summarize it by saying since 2003, I've been focusing on coping with vulnerability. And that vulnerability can include anything. It can include poverty, it can include disability, it can include behavioral problems, learning problems, any kind of struggle that a learner is experiencing in school. So I basically follow a positive approach, a positive psychology approach. I'm a psychologist, educational psychologist, and I adhere to the asset-based approach. I look at teachers and communities and parents and learners themselves and see how can the system and the environment accommodate a learner to cope better with vulnerability. So then over the recent years, my shift moved into visual disability, visual impairment specifically based on the EU funding and the project in collaboration with the DHET. So now we're focusing specifically on visually impaired children and how are they accommodated in schools? How can they be supported by the system, by teachers, for them to be more resilient, for them to cope better, for them to flourish in society as they grow up.
Thank you so much for that, Ronelle. The whole idea and the principle of resilience of our children who are visually impaired is very important. And so we're really excited about the work you're doing at your center as well. And you mentioned the asset-based approach. And I like to think that you're probably speaking about our children as the children with visual impairment needs in terms of their confidence and their sense of self and their identity, and drawing that from the system and from teachers. Particularly keen to see how the members, the participants in this webinar respond to your issue of how the system can support these children. And perhaps we could utilize some of those findings of yours and discuss that with the Department of Basic Education and other universities. So colleagues, let's move on to the second question that I'd like to quickly go through with Claudine, Jean, and Ronelle. And the question is a very short one. In President Ramaphosa's statement, his response to the 2019 SONA address, he actually acknowledged, and I'll read his words, he says, "We know and concede that with respect to the rights of people with disabilities, we have not achieved nearly enough." What is your opinion about that, Ronelle? While you are on the screen and we see your video, could you please respond to that? And then Claudine. And Jean, I've realized that I left you out of the conversation for question 1. So we will ask you to talk to question 1 and 2 as well. So Ronelle, respond to President Ramaphosa.
Thank you, Michelle. I definitely agree. I think on policy level, we've come a far way. And I think people talking about inclusive education, doing research in inclusive education has made the shift, and we've been pushing towards it. However, I think on a practical ground root level, the teachers are still uncertain. I'll talk to the research we've done a little bit later, but we found that teachers are very willing to accommodate children and very willing to implement inclusive education, but they're still uncertain. They still say, we don't have resources, we don't know how to do it. And if I think about that against the background of our training in South Africa over the years, many years ago, teachers weren't necessarily trained in inclusive education and the accommodation of children with disabilities or within the various fields of disability studies. And therefore, I think teachers are uncertain. If we think of visual impairment specifically, the fact that there's no formal qualification in South Africa, a formal program that's offered, emphasize what I'm saying, that teachers feel that they're not geared. We have short learning programs, and we've got MOOCs, and we've got online courses, but teachers often feel, what do I do with this? I'm not skilled, I'm not trained. So that's my opinion. I definitely agree. And I definitely think that we should do a lot more in our pre-service training programs. We're moving in that direction because inclusive education is now included, but also with our teachers in the profession, really having more workshops with them, doing more with them to be better equipped to take this and really implement it. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Ronelle. I think working for government, I take your point about policy and the challenges we have with policy. I think Professor Syed indicated that policies are often symbolic, and although they're dazzling, and so really it is up to us to ensure that we implement policies and we make sure that they give clear guidelines in terms of what we want to achieve. So thank you very much for that. And your question about a lack of formal qualification in visual impairment is quite concerning for me. I think there's an opportunity there for a request for some funding, possibly from EU, because Dr. Ray did indicate their interest in this particular area, and to see whether we can develop capacity, at least at University of Pretoria, to develop a professional qualification in this area. Thank you very much, Ronelle. And Jean, well, Claudine, are you next? Yes. Claudine?
You know, Mr. President, we're so thrilled that you've noticed and recognized this. However, what I would like to raise is we have formal qualifications in deaf education, and I have had for many years, Mr. President. And although inclusion is going a good way, and we've got policies in place, we are not requiring teachers of the deaf to have any qualification in deafness. Now, they're all qualified teachers, so we thank you for that, Mr. President. But for a teacher to go into a school for the deaf, and number one, only has a short course in sign language, which again we thank you for, because we've recognized that sign language is needed, but there is no understanding of deaf culture, deaf pedagogy, and the special way that one teaches in a different way because they are totally different language speakers. And so, Mr. President, we ask that you would please require all teachers of the deaf to have a formal deaf education qualification. We have many options for teachers thanks to the funding from the EU, and that they're given 5 years, after which they then may be channeled into other areas of education if they choose not to be educated in specialized deaf education. We have it online, face-to-face. So really, teachers of the deaf have no more excuses, but to say that they can do it with a short course is just not enough. And then, of course, to thank you, Mr. President, for the South African Sign Language CAPS document. We are thrilled. And so we now expect you to help implement this. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Trust you, Claudine, to make this answer part of you and your personality. I want to, my colleague from the Department of Higher Education and Training, who works in disability units, Ceci, I'm not sure if you hear it, but Ceci is on the working group for disability. It's a presidential working group. And Ceci, please speak to me after this so we can get a clip of Claudine, Ronelle, Jean, and what they are saying to our President Ramaphosa. Thank you, Claudine. Jean, you have 2 questions to answer. If you could please take question 1, which was, why have you chosen this area of work? And what is the distinguishing feature or scope of your work? And then secondly, a response to our President. Thank you, Jean. We are not hearing from Jean.
Oh, sorry. Is it working now? Great.
Yes, it's working now. Thank you, Jean.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for remembering that I'm also part of this panel. Thank you, Michelle.
Sorry.
So I'm from the University of Johannesburg, and I'm an educational psychologist. I have been working as an educational psychologist for many years, and I've been involved in training of teachers long before inclusion came on the scene, and we were then dealing with learners who have all sorts of difficulties at schools. Yes. And so being able to recognize and ensure that learners with, I deal with all the neurodevelopmental difficulties. So we're looking at children who have intellectual disabilities, dyslexia, dyscalculia, problems with communication, and these are often those invisible, hidden disabilities. You don't see them, but the children are sitting in classrooms, they're sitting in mainstream schools, they are not all in special schools. So to have teachers in everyday general education schools being able to know how to differentiate the curriculum, put in place universal design for learning, assessment accommodations, all these policy implementation of the policy is what we're finding is the difficult thing on the ground. So our scope at in the center has been focusing very much on how do we train both pre-service teachers and in-service teachers to put these wonderful policies, for instance, the policy on screening, identification, assessment and support, the CS policy, which is operationalizing, putting in place how we implement the Education White Paper 6. So we've been focusing very much on those aspects in our center, and a lot of our research has been around particularly those things, because yes, we all know about White Paper 6 and we know about the vision and where we're going with full service schools and school-based support teams and so on. But as everyone has said previously, it's how one implements it and puts it in place on the ground. So that's been a lot of our focus in our center. If you can move to the next slide. Our center is developing, we've got programs for teacher education, and I don't know who's controlling the slide. If you can move to the next one, thank you. So we have developed it's disappeared. We have developed a website, and the website goes into various different this wide range of disabilities that we're looking at in neurodevelopmental needs. So we're looking at dyslexia, intellectual disability, and these all come with difficult emotional baggage and difficult behaviors. And often we find that these are the things that teachers are having difficulty coping with in the classroom because of the inability to control inhibitions, the attention deficits that go with it, the problems around socializing and being part of a group and understanding the communication, the underlying communication and dynamics happening in classrooms. So for us, the focus is very much on schools, teachers in schools, and how they can support these learners with this wide range of difficulties that are manifesting. So Michelle, can you just guide me if I'm answering all your questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Jean. Appreciate it. I think you've answered 2 in 1 there. I see some comments coming up from the chat, which are related to what you're saying. You're working with teachers in schools, and I'm sure later on you'll speak about the School of Autism. But the comment says teachers must be empowered to take control of their own learning. And I think that you and the other colleagues are working very well in that regard. But what I particularly like, and thank you for this comment from the person who wrote this in the chat. He or she has suggested that teachers should form communities of practice. And so they encourage each other, motivate each other, and learn from each other as well. So thank you so much for that, Jean. My next question to Jean, Claudine, and Jean, if you stay on now, Jean, Claudine, and Ronelle, is around the COVID-19 pandemic. And this crops up in so many webinars that I've been lucky to attend. So we know that it's had a drastic impact on our student and our teacher engagement in education and training. What innovations did you implement? One, possibly, Jean, because we're running out of time a bit. What innovations did you implement to make sure that your student teachers or even teachers who are in service were still able to engage in the programs that you were offering? And that will be the same question for Claudine and Ronelle, but I'd also like you, please, not just to blow your own trumpet about that, but to be a little more realistic and tell us whether this worked well or not and why. Thank you, Jean.
Okay, so we are lucky that all our programs were already online or in a blended mode before the lockdown. And thanks to the EU funding, we had already started working on the content for all those materials within the online platform. So all that the lockdown did for us was throw us really into online learning in a full way. And we all then, instead of going and giving a workshop, an enrichment workshop on how to do, make teaching aids or whatever things we were going to do, we now had to do it all online. And students had to learn a whole lot of new skills, like how to make videos of them teaching and videos of them helping a child who has a problem, and then uploading a video onto the online platform so that we could have a look at what they were doing in the classroom with learners. So it has been, it's been very useful. The thing that hasn't worked so well often is that our students have landed without devices and bandwidth and technology a lot of the times in very rural places. So we've had to be very creative in the way that we have given them access and used WhatsApp teaching and Google Classroom. And there's all sorts of different platforms that tutors and lecturers have been using to assist learners to continue to access the curriculum during this lockdown. So thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Jean. We're getting a lot of comments and questions on the chat, but I need to move to Ronelle now. Ronelle, if you could talk to us a little bit about the innovative ways in which you managed the COVID-19 challenges in terms of your teaching and learning.
Thank you, Michelle. I think very similar to what Jean said, basically being forced to be creative and move online, and then thinking very carefully and very critically of the material that we include when we do online, because that links to the bandwidth and the access to Wi-Fi and the accessibility of the learning material for students. Luckily at our institution, we supported students that did not have access to internet, and several laptops was made available for students that needed that. So we could do that. I think something else that I would like to just bring to the fore, just one thing, is I think we also had to think more creatively of how to assess students, because the planned assessment couldn't play out as we planned it. So we had to think very creatively there, and that allowed for students in turn to also think more creatively of their assessment practices one day when in school, and being flexible and going with what we can work with. So I think in a nutshell, that's what I would highlight.
Yes, thank you for that, Ronelle. I must say that when the members of the webinar registered, they were asked to indicate certain questions that they would like to be answered. We had about 125 of those questions, but in particular, one of them was around the how it is that children with autism are able to cope in a school, in a full-service school. Should they be in a full-service school? I'm going to ask Jean to speak about this earlier on, but one of the comments in the chat, very interesting, indicated that the person who wrote in the chat indicated that he or she has noticed that children with ADD and DHED had challenges in terms of the movement into remote and synchronous and asynchronous learning. So that's certainly something to worry about, but I think it's not a discussion for today. We would need to take it forward. I think personally that the focus on ensuring access to children in schools particularly, and to university students, focused a lot on children who were in mainstream schools. And I am concerned around the high number of children with disabilities that have been identified as being out of school during that particular period. Nikki is going to speak a little about that. And so Claudine, is it just you now?
Yes.
One more panelist to respond to that before we go to our second last question.
Thanks, Michelle. We were able to develop marvelous COVID videos, all in South African Sign Language, and in such a way that they were actually generically signed with a bit of an international sign language flair, so that we could allow that information to go out. Because kudos again to Mr. President that we had our sign language interpreter there, but it really was only there for the really big announcements. None of the other information went out to deaf people in an accessible form. And if it did go out in a really simplistic form for children, there were no subtitles in English. And so we created 10 different videos in South African Sign Language using the mainstream information of what is COVID, COVID in the workplace, COVID for kids, and information for parents. And 2 of our videos, COVID for kids, had 5.6 thousand views. And COVID in the workplace had 7.6 thousand views. And so that was really wonderful. And we were very impressed with the Department of DBE for their guidelines that they were able to adapt for deaf children, so that masking, where you can't see lips for lip reading, but half the face is not visible, and sign language has a huge linguistic aspect on the face. And so the DBE were able to adapt that and say that the face shields were possible. So we were very, very pleased about that. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudine. We move now on to specific questions that I've designed for our 4 panelists. And Claudine, while you're there, I think we'll start off with you. Claudine, the Centre for Deaf Studies has been particularly successful in producing the innovative and exciting teaching and learning resource material for the deaf through the EU funding, as you rightly pointed out. But my question to you was to take us through some of the resources, and I know that you've preempted that already. You have discussed and you've put up a slide on some of them. The question of how do you show their value in teaching? What were your design principles underpinning the development? Now, you've mentioned the YouTube videos, and I'm hoping that we're going to give the link through to the members of the webinar. But more importantly, Claudine, I would like you to speak about how you used the knowledge standards for inclusive teaching that were developed by the University of Witwatersrand. Professor Lee Reisnick developed those. And those standards, knowledge and practice standards, were integrated into the British Council's work, the Teaching for All module, as well as into the wonderful work that VVOB has done. And if anyone from VVOB here, I think is here, Wilfred, congratulations to you on receiving the, I think it's a global award for excellence. Yours was excellence in the Bambanani material that was developed. So really good work there. And I think people will be interested in actually trying to get access to that. So if you could give us some links that we can send through to everyone. So Claudine, back to you. Yeah. We had an issue when Claudine was developing some of her material, because those of us who reviewed it, and Claudine won't mind me saying so because she's very open about this and the learnings, when people reviewed it, there was a strong feeling that the first series in her 3 series of books was not inclusive enough. I'll ask Claudine just to share what happened in that experience and how she learned how to change this.
Thank you. So the basic principles of inclusivity and knowledge base and best practice is for us always been an issue of disability and language and culture. So the first step was we didn't think of race. We always focused on gender and disability, so we wanted to make sure there were hearing kids, deaf kids, there were children in wheelchairs. We don't just like all the pretty faces, we like fat and thin kids, we like freckly kids, red hair, glasses, no glasses. But one of the key things we forgot was actually, oh my word, let's look at the racial inclusion. And the feedback that was given was so marvelous that we then had a second book that we sent out, and then of course our Deaf Heroes book for teenagers. But we took it a step further, and we made sure then that our storybooks were translated into South African Sign Language, signed English, and made accessible in English and cute speech. And then we took it a step further and said, let's take the book away and let's tell the story in South African Sign Language using deaf ways of being. All our materials are like that. We focus on teachers, parents, and children. They are CAPS related, and so they connect with any class. They can be used in the sign language class and the English class, and we also teach teacher skills. So we've actually got pedagogical workbooks where we tell them how to use the materials, and again, just inviting people to access the materials online for free.
Thank you, Claudine. In fact, there was some comments in the chat about teachers really struggle. They might have resources, but they struggle in terms of how to actually use those resources. I want to just ask you to spend 1 minute on something very interesting. Claudine has done work in what she calls dual instruction, I think bilingual instruction, Claudine. And when I first heard of it, I thought, but what bilingual instruction are you talking about? Which languages? But so Claudine, if you could just give us a quick description of what that is all about. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for raising that. That was our main focus in our research project funded by the EU, is so many people talk about bilingual education and they use English and sign language, but actually they just use Funigalo in the class. Let's use a mix of everything. And so we piloted pure and true bilingual education where both languages, sign language and English, and we talk South African Sign Language and English, were used next to each other totally equally by a deaf first language user and a teacher that was English first language user who happened to be deaf as well. And we actually piloted it, collected research and data all the time, and our children flourished. And so true bilingual education means South African Sign Language is used by either a first language user or a natively signer, an equitable, wonderful signer, and English. Both must be 100% accessible. So we're not talking about oral education. You can use oral education for kids that are hard of hearing, but always think maybe there is a kid in the class who can't, then you either use cute speech or signed English or subtitles. And the results are remarkable, and part of our results for the DHET and EU funding is to write a research report on that. So watch this space.
Thank you, Claudine. I think you're touching on what Professor Cowley spoke about in her comments around the focus on literacy for children with special needs. I was quite intrigued by that because in South Africa we do focus a lot on literacy. We have a wealth of reading programs that are being implemented, and that's based on all the assessments that are undertaken on our children. I just mentioned the PALS, but I personally haven't had the experience of looking at assessment on literacy skills for
Michelle, you've gone mute. Michelle?
I'm not sure how that happened. I'm not sure what you heard, but I was speaking about the literacy initiatives that Professor Cowley spoke about, and how for me personally, the focus on literacy development in our country, based on our poor results, of course, that we all know about, is on verbal language, but mainly for children in mainstream schools. But what about assessment of literacy and language in children who have special needs? It would be interesting if anybody has had experience of any kind of research in that area, so please put that up in the chat. And so to be fully inclusive, we should focus on that as well for our children to develop their language skills. Thank you for that, Claudine. I'm moving now to Nikki, who, you know, Nikki, I've heard during lockdown, and I've read about stories in the newspaper, that during lockdown, many parents with children who had special needs were struggling to cope with their children because they were at home. They couldn't attend schools. And in fact, there was one mum who reported in a newspaper that she was so frustrated and so worried about her child that she decided she would open up her own little school at home. It was so positively received that she had 15 children. In the report that I read about 2 weeks ago, parents brought the children to a little school. She managed to get some community members to help, and they did something with the children during that time. I don't know, the newspaper article didn't go into depth about that. But Nikki, what would you advise community members to do if they are interested in actually starting up something like that? How would they best be skilled to ensure that they would add value to the lives of the children that they are looking after in the community?
Thank you for that
Thanks,
question,
Nikki.
Michelle. Thank you for that question, Michelle. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Nikki.
Okay. Well, I would say to that mum and to that person in the community, be it urban or rural community, I would say start building your network, your support, your network of support. And that means that you need to seek out people that can assist you on your journey to start off with. Our rehabilitation community workers, or in the Western Cape, we have rehabilitation community workers that are trained to teach members of the community how to access services within their community and resources within their community that can build their capacity. So, for example, if that mum found her rehabilitation worker, and that person would link her up with non-governmental organizations, NPOs, disabled people's organizations. That person would also link her with special care, special education centers in the community, or further outreach programs that would be able to provide supportive assistance, or even just guide her on her journey of how to go about accessing the resources and the tools that she would require to set up a project like that, to set up her own school, to the rehabilitation community worker is also able to guide the learner, but also the family and the community that would assist that child in accessing education or delivering education. So because their focus is on rehabilitation, let's say to profound disabilities, they would be able to assist the mom or the community with positioning advice of really integrating the basic interventions that rehabilitation professionals provide, like physios, audiologists, speech therapists. These community members are not professional people, but they are provided with basic interventional skills that can assist people in their homes, with their families, with their disabled children, in how to improve access to education. And so really building that network of support, and really finding her voice in order to get more, and training herself using the online resources that's available on special education, inclusive education. There are lots of MOOCs that are available online, but also I would encourage her to use very basic low-tech resources that are out there and that are free for the community members to access.
That's such amazing information, Nikki. Really, really valuable, because a lot of the questions were about community people, people in the community, and what they could do to help children with special needs. I'm flabbergasted by the free access to so many resources that you have mentioned. I think we will ask you to give us a list of those and links to those and contact numbers. But my only reservation is that this is in the Western Cape only. Yeah. Am I right?
Yes, yes, it is, Michelle, because the Department of Health piloted this project of training community workers with a special focus on disability practice way back in 2012. That was the pilot, but there wasn't an ongoing follow-up for training these community workers. And so what we've struggled with, and it's been a huge challenge for us, is funding. It's been a huge challenge because we are training them at a higher certificate level, which is an NQF5, but we're doing it at our university, at a higher education and training facility. So the course is accredited. However, they don't have access to NSFAS funding, which is vitally important, because if you think of the entrant, the candidate that is that comes into this program, they require financial assistance in a huge way, and funding has been a problem with getting more rehabilitation community workers out there. So we have the Department of Health, through initiatives with NGOs and NPOs. They have there are a lot of rehabilitation community workers working in the community, but mostly within NGOs and sort of privately funded organizations, and we really need more job opportunities, career opportunities for them, so that they can assist the community where they're doing valuable work. Even in COVID, they've been doing phenomenal work for the government, but not really having the job opportunities that they need to have in order to fulfill their role.
Yes. So the issue of funding is important. I think that there is gravitas for this kind of work. I know that my colleague from the Community Education and Training branch is on the webinar, and particularly to learn a bit more about this. But I'm also putting it out there to the provincial departments of education as well, that funds programs and short learning courses for in-service teachers, to consider reaching out to you, but also to our universities in other provinces and our department officials, Department of Basic Education officials in other provinces. We need to see how this can be rolled out. What Nikki is doing at UCT can be rolled out to communities in other provinces. We do have community schools, adults and community schools in our provinces, and that's just something new that's been implemented. So I think there's good cause for lots of engagement and discussion about this. Thank you so much for that, Nikki.
Thank you.
Jean, there's a question on the chat that talks about children being disadvantaged by being told from the district support team to go to special needs schools. And this particular writer in the chat believes that they could learn much better if they were in mainstream schools. So Jean, in your experience, would you agree that children with neurodevelopmental learning needs may be placed in mainstream all full service schools, and why or why not?
Yes, that's always a difficult question. Generally, if one looks at neurodevelopmental learning needs, they are on a wide range. There's a spectrum of disorders, and they range from mild difficulties with reading, writing, doing maths, coping with the curriculum, all the way to very severe and profound problems where a child is severely, profoundly intellectually disabled, or having real difficulties with communication, with attention. So I would say it depends on the individual child, exactly what are their unique needs, what are the difficulties that that child is experiencing, and is there a match that can be made between the child's needs and what the school can offer, and the school, how the school can accommodate, what are the things that the school has in place, the resources, the teachers that are trained, the ability to do assessment adaptations. Are there facilities for coping with the child who has this disability? So yes, I would say that a and in fact every single mainstream school has children with neurodevelopmental learning needs in it. There's no school without a child who has attention problems, who is having difficulty with reading, who's having difficulty with coping with the school curriculum. So these teachers are dealing with these children every day, but it's a matter, for me, it's a matter of how severe is the difficulty. And if it's very severe, then I would say that they need to be in a place where there's a smaller class, not so many children, where there is support from maybe an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, somebody who can assist with changing and adapting as the particular child needs. So yes, our teachers are dealing with this every day, all day, and well done to all the teachers who are out there having to teach children with attention deficit during lockdown, because they have to keep their attention focused through a medium, through a computer or a WhatsApp, and not actually being able to walk up to the child and put your hand on their shoulder and make sure that they can focus on the work. So I think that coming back to your previous comment, Michelle, on the difficulties that children with disabilities are having, I think that there's been a lot of children who have not coped as well with this. But on the other hand, some of the children have done very well. For instance, I know some children with autism, you were mentioning autism, who have difficulty with socializing and who have difficulty in the classroom with all the distractions that are going on. And they've coped very well with online teaching because it's focused, they can attend without getting distracted. They don't have to socially interact with people that they have difficulty doing because it's part of the disability. So there are a lot of children who have done very, very well. But I agree, some children have had a tough time.
Yes, Jean, but I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you on something, Jean. The elephant in the room has been raised by Smangaliso Shikwambana. Thank you for your comments, Smangaliso. Smangaliso spoke about the problem is that priority is essential in rural schools. And so, Jean, you've really done some amazing work and you've answered the question very clearly in terms of levels. But what can we do? How can we get all those strategies that you've implemented to remote rural areas where we do have children with special needs, and all those resources are not available there? I mean, if we're going to be inclusive, then something needs to be done about transferring what your successes are to remote schools, but also adapting to that environment. What are your thoughts on that, Jean?
I can tell you what some of my teachers have done in remote schools. They have been doing a lot of teaching on their cell phones, which I have found absolutely amazing, that you can use your WhatsApp to do little voice recordings and video recordings. And it appears that most, certainly most parents in rural places, wherever they are, have a cell phone. So there's been a lot of use of maybe it's technology, but low-tech solutions. And teachers have been sending little messages and little notes home and putting up making little websites for their kids to put things on. So I hear what you're saying, but I think everyone has access to a cell phone.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Jean. Appreciated. We are 5 minutes short of our time. I have to also say that we've been answering many questions throughout the discussion, so I'm happy about the time taken thus far. But we really need to get Ronelle to just quickly discuss her findings in that great research project that she undertook. I like your methodology that you've used there, Ronelle. So if you could, in 2 minutes, just quickly talk to that.
Thanks, Michelle, for the opportunity. 2 minutes is very little when it comes to research.
Okay, I'll give you 3.
So as part of the EU-funded project that in collaboration with the DHET, we were tasked to develop an advanced diploma in visual impairment studies. And we decided that we cannot do that before we consult with teachers on ground level. So in the end, we visited 17 schools in 5 provinces in South Africa. We worked with 252 teachers where we asked them 3 sets of questions. The first related to inclusive education and how they understand that and how they think they are implementing policy. The second related to visual impaired learners. And then the third in terms of recommendations of what should be included in such a diploma. Parallel to that, we had colloquiums with stakeholders in South Africa with experts in the field of visual impairment, asking them similar questions. And I'm going to highlight 3 important findings for me. There were many, but I'm just going to attend to 3. The very first one is our teachers are really willing to implement inclusive education. They understand the value, they are excited about it, they think it's needed, they think it should be done. But together with that, secondly, and that relates to what Tracy commented in the chats earlier, and there was some conversation around that, is our teachers don't feel competent. Despite the efforts from the department to do training at schools, and despite documents that are created, and despite the pre-service programs now including modules on inclusive educations, teachers still don't believe in their own ability. They could tell us what it is and they could tell us what's important, but when asked why don't they do it, they would say, but I don't know how to. So they're not aware of their own wealth of resources in themselves and amongst themselves to just take it forward and implement it. And together with that, on a practical level, things like resources, things like teaching a blind learner, having a braille machine, things like that. It's a very practical and it's a reality. So that was mentioned. And then thirdly, and that was something that Glynis also commented on, teachers realized the importance of networks because following a participatory approach, we had several sessions with the teachers and the participants in the end became resources amongst themselves. They would share ideas and they would phone a friend and they would learn from one another. So that was also something that stood out in the project.
Thanks, Ronelle. I think you've highlighted some important principles here. First of all, that anything that's designed for teachers should actually be designed taking into account the lived experiences, the knowledge, and the skills that people have at the grassroots level. And I think you've done that successfully by including the teachers themselves in this. But I also like the tangential results and value adds in terms of you've created a community of practice amongst those teachers. So thank you very, very much for that. It's much appreciated. Colleagues, it's time for us to close. We have 1 minute left. I just want to thank Karen Herbert around the comments regarding ISPS, that will actually help children to cope better in mainstream schools. And I also would like at some point, maybe in the breakaway sessions, for us to discuss the issue of employment possibilities for children who attend special needs schools. And finally, just to contextualize, and thank, I can't remember who it is now that made the comment, it's gone up, that made the comment that inclusive education is not just about special needs. I had hoped that Judith's explanation at the beginning had actually indicated that. I love the way that she had articulated it there. The focus of this particular session in the webinar was to speak about special needs and how universities are trying to address this to ensure that our teachers are skilled. So, of course, we understand that other issues like language, culture, social environment, the economy, and even family households, how those are actually designed will impact on our children in terms of them also being catered for in inclusive education. So with that, I want to thank the panelists for the wealth of information that they have given. I want to thank the members of this webinar for the amazing comments, the insightful questions that have been placed on the chat. We will have access to this and post the webinar, and the committee will sit and look at that and see what we could do about generating some kind of report or document to you. It's now my pleasure to introduce somebody who is working very, very closely with teacher education, Professor Thuli Diale. Welcome to the webinar. Thuli is the head of Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Johannesburg and has become very integrally involved in DHE teacher education projects. In fact, she successfully presented a proposal for the DHET and EU to fund the physical establishment of the Center for Neurodevelopmental Learning Needs, and UJ came to the table by supplying a building just for that. Professor Diale, hand over to you for your presentation on the training of teachers for disability inclusive education. Professor Diale, I think you just joined.
Hi. Thank you. I'm just trying to share the screen. Please let me know when you can see my screen. Michelle?
We can see it.
We can.
You can see the screen. Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you once more for being invited into this webinar that is important and very close to my heart, not only as an academic, but also as an educational psychologist and as a community person who's coming from a background of people with disabilities. My talk today is on training of teachers for disability inclusive education. And, you know, I'm actually thinking, what exactly or how exactly do we train teachers in terms of inclusive education? And this brought me back to actually thinking, I forgot to apologize, please, for joining late. We have the CHE audits for our doctorates, and I was part of the panel, so I had to excuse myself from the panel to join. So my apologies to joining late. So for me, inclusive education actually has to do with inclusion as a process of addressing and responding to students' diversity by increasing their participation in learning, in their cultures and their communities, and reducing exclusion within and from education. This definition that was given by UNESCO in 2005 actually talks to the many things that we are supposed to be doing. But the question is, are they happening, and are we doing them in terms of addressing and responding to students' diversity? So the ultimate goal of inclusive education is to ensure that the society members or the members of the society are able to fulfill their potential and participate optimally in education, and that the education system is open to all learners, regardless of their status, abilities, or disabilities. So from that perspective, if I have to think of teacher education and inclusive education and teacher readiness or preparedness or their training in terms of inclusive education, I actually have to take you back, colleagues, and actually request us to think of how have we migrated, or have we even migrated from exclusion to inclusion of persons with disabilities. We all know that we come from a perspective where exclusion simply had to do with people with disabilities having no services and only families had to look after them. And because they were despised and ignored. And most of the time in some of our cultures, or maybe even most of our cultures, they were cursed, they were labeled as being possessed by demons. With others, parents or families believed it was witchcraft. So most of these people were hidden in families and became unknown persons within the society. And gradually we moved into segregation as more and more information and learning became available or known in terms of inclusion and inclusive education. But we started at a point where even though we're thinking we're including, within the inclusion itself, we were segregating. Services were made special for those people. For an example, special schools were for special people, special learners with special disabilities. And in that, they were excluded in the bigger activities of learning and development and the bigger activities of the society. Yet when they went back home, they were part of the society. They were part of their peers who are said to be normal or who are said not to have any disabilities. They were given particular special treatment, and in inverted commas, their disability was seen as a problem. Moving forward and coming into the UNESCO and actually the Bill of Rights, we saw more and more integration, integrating people with disabilities, changing persons with disabilities. We're beginning to gradually see treatment or equal treatment of people with disabilities. And we now are in the green zone. However, we're still struggling with the green zone of inclusion. While we know that in terms of policies, in terms of legislation, and in terms of law, inclusion means the rights of persons with disabilities have to be fully acknowledged. There should be changes in schools, in institutions, and in organizations. Equality of them means they should receive support that they need to thrive and achieve their potential. And we need to actually acknowledge that everyone has a gift to bring to the table of education and learning, and they've got something to contribute to our economy. We find ourselves still struggling fully to implement policy. And this actually, part of implementing policy and our struggle to implement policy has to do with us struggling with ensuring that all teachers are fully trained in terms of inclusive education, not only in theory, but how they implement it fully in practice. We all know the benefits of inclusive education, and I think we all, if we are advocates of change, we all want to see the benefits of inclusive education that has to be more caring and promoting human rights so that it can contribute to the economic factors or the economic establishment of the country. I am not going to talk about the legislative policies. I am just mentioning them there to you, but I've spoken about them, that it is unfortunate that as a country, we're in a position where we have all these beautiful policies, that we have even signed the international conventions about these beautiful policies. However, we are in a position where practice doesn't actually come into effect. And the biggest question is here, that are we training teachers for the reality of inclusive education? Or is it a beautiful policy that is there to show the world that our country is doing something about people with disabilities? The answers are just lying ahead of us. And I think the answers are like a puzzle. And part of the puzzle is that missing part that has answers. And answers are lying in each and every one of us, because it is that the answers are in the DHET, in the DBE, in the universities, in the communities, in the external funders. Thank you to the European Union for ensuring that we are beginning to make sure that inclusive education becomes live in the country. Organizations as stakeholders that are mentioned there. So in practicing inclusive education, our guest speaker at the beginning spoke about teachers, and I love the fact that he spoke about that, because I heard that teachers are enablers of inclusive education. And if teachers are to be enablers of inclusive education, they need to be able to understand what inclusion is and see inclusion as a continuing process and not as a one-time event. At this stage, I feel like inclusion is becoming a one-time event, where we will take teachers onto a week's training and they come back and it becomes business as usual in schools. And that is where we are trying, that is where we actually are failing our people with disabilities. Because post-training these teachers, I am not sure what are the processes that are there to ensure that we see that these are implemented in school, that teachers' practice within the classrooms are changing, and teachers' way of dealing with learners with disabilities are changing. And maybe the question is, are we training them fully and efficiently? Because it might be that they are coming back to school and are unable to practice what they have learned in a week's training or a 2 weeks training or even a 6 months training, because they don't have the opportunity to actually practice it within our school system that is so much driven out of results. That is so much results driven, at the end of the year. So how do we strengthen and sustain the participation of all? The teachers, the students, the parents, the communities. How do we restructure the culture, the policies and the practices in schools to respond to diversity? For instance, the culture in mainstream schools. Let us take high schools. The culture in high schools is we prepare you for matric, for the final year where you are writing your grade 12, and we need to ensure that our school shines and gets 80% so that Minister Angie Motshekga can be able to call it in the list. But in the process of doing that, is that culture actually excluding learners with disabilities? And it could be disabilities, because we tend to look at disabilities at actually extrinsic disabilities. But it could be learners with really minimal intrinsic disabilities, that if we take an extra mile, we can make a difference. Learners with neurodevelopmental disabilities, that if we take an extra mile, we can make a difference instead of being actually results driven. How do we identify and provide support for those learners? How do we ensure that our curriculum is accessible? The issue of curriculum in South Africa is an interesting issue, and an issue that needs full debate in terms of curriculum transformation and ensuring that appropriate training programs for all teachers within our institutions is done. For me, I believe training of teachers is not about training particular teachers, but I believe all teachers. Inclusive education has to be for all teachers who are trained in all institutions. And when we do in-service training for teachers, it shouldn't be for particular teachers, but it should be for all teachers in schools, because all teachers work with diverse learners in their classrooms. We need to acknowledge that we do have barriers to teacher training and practice of inclusive education. The first one is the negative approach that we take, because we tend to seek and look at disability from a really medical model that looks at disabilities from the learners themselves, instead of looking at disabilities or in terms of looking at barriers from a systemic challenge. The lack of physical and material facilities in many of our children or many of our schools. We know that there are no physical facilities or even material facilities to ensure that inclusive education takes place fully. Lack of funding, lack of trained teachers, social discrimination that leads to emotional, but also the silo mentality. Deal with these issues in silos. Also, poor collaboration among service providers and competition versus collaboration in terms of ensuring that inclusive education takes place. So I believe that in terms of training of teachers for disability and inclusive education, the answer lies in collaboration. And collaboration starts with what we have started thanks to the European Union and the DHET in terms of the centers of excellence that UCT vets as centers of excellence that look at the various disabilities that have been funded for. But also, in addition, we need to begin to look as the 4 universities that have been given the opportunity to actually train teachers in the various disabilities or the various fields of disabilities. How do we then begin to train other institutions? Because the reality is, amongst the 4 of us, we can never reach the country. We can never be transformative. We can never make a difference if we focus on only the 4 of us, but forget to look at other institutions around the country and also other NGOs that can contribute. So in conclusion, colleagues, having said that, it is important that as many of our colleagues in the 4 other institutions, I will briefly talk about my particular institution and how do we train teachers in terms of inclusive education. We actually, in terms of inclusive education and as part of funding, at the B.Ed level or the undergraduate level, pre-service, pre-education level, we have introduced the neurodevelopmental learning needs course or module that is offered at the first year and the second year of study. And at the third year and fourth year of study, we are actually offering it as a methodology. And these kinds of teachers that get out trained from this module of the neurodevelopmental learning needs are able to go at their 4th year level, which is starting next year. They are going to 4th year next year. They are going to be able to be placed in special schools as part of their work integrated learning to ensure that special schools and full service schools, to ensure that we can actually fulfill the needs of inclusive education. At a postgraduate level, we offer an advanced diploma in remedial education that actually helps in looking at how we can best train teachers who were not trained post their qualification in terms of inclusive education. And also the postgraduate diploma in education that we also look at how we can best train teachers. There's lack of time. I will not go into those modules, but you are welcome, colleagues, to touch us, to be in contact with us, that we can take you through our specialization programs that we are offering as the University of Johannesburg. But I am more than anything willing and excited that we can collaborate as institutions and see how do we together ensure that we take out a fully fledged, comprehensive, all-rounder teacher who can not deal with one particular disability, but can be able to deal with different disabilities across the board in terms of the different short learning programs we offer and fully registered programs that we offer within our institutions. So having said that, I want to close by saying, I want us to reflect that our lives today is the result of our attitude and choices in the past. Our lives tomorrow will be the results of the attitude and the choices we make today. I hope today from this webinar, we are going to be able to make right choices for our people, for our children, but more so for our country, so that we can one day say, yes, we've contributed into a fully inclusive South Africa. Ke a leboga, ngiyabonga, ndiyabulela, bayadanki. Thank you, colleagues.
Are you there, Michelle?
I thought you were addressing this.
That's fine. That's fine. I'll carry on then. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Prof. Diali, for a very insightful analysis and for proposing exciting future strategies. I hope that we, even from today, will be able to develop that collaboration a little bit further. If there is we could entertain maybe one or two questions. I see there's a lot of response in the chat room, appreciating very much your analysis and the perspective that you've given. If anybody has a particular question, we could take that. If you want to put a hand up, or if any of my colleagues in the team would like to alert me to a particular question. I think what has been happening in the chat is largely one of the things that came up very strongly in the chat was your point that it is not just about one-off training, but that inclusion is a process and that it can't just be achieved in a one-off. I wonder if you would be able to give us some idea whether you are involved in that ongoing teacher support or how you view that ongoing teacher support and development moving forward.
Moving forward, thank you, Judith, for your question. Maybe I will answer from the University of Johannesburg's perspective.
Thank you.
In actual fact, our AD and PGT programs in the past have actually been contact qualifications. However, having moved, which was actually before we even got into COVID, it became a strategic move, but COVID actually has made it even more live. Starting at the beginning of this year, even before COVID, we actually moved our modules into being online modules because we saw the need of the fact that having contact courses actually only allow for those people who are within Gauteng or even within Johannesburg, because there are people within Gauteng that cannot be able to attend classes within the University of Johannesburg. But moving these programs to be online actually will allow us not only for people within the country, but we are actually targeting that we are actually will be able to have these programs offered internationally. And through the help of the European Union and the DHET, actually with the sponsors, we have begun to develop further our programs that we've been offered to put them to be an online program. And through the website that we all have, the 4 universities, we are also putting material there to support teachers that are available online. So within the university, yes, that's what we are doing in terms of online. However, we also are giving short learning programs that we have been giving for various departments of education. We've offered programs, short learning programs for the Mpumalanga Department of Education, the Gauteng Department of Education, the Eastern Cape Department of Education, which we are planning to move online so that we can be able to attract more of the people to be able to train them in the field. I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that it reminds me of that phrase that we're using at our university about the gift of COVID. And for all the trials and tribulations that it has posed to us, we can also talk about the gift of COVID. And I also wanted just to highlight a particular collaboration that was very interesting for us from UCT, is that Dr. Jean Fourie incorporated one of our MOOCs in one of our online courses into her program, and it was a lovely collaboration to see that our materials in a short online course were being able to support the full program. And I think there are creative ways of looking at how we can collaborate further. So thank you for that invitation that you've made to all of us to be able to collaborate in future. Thank you so much, Prof. Excellent. Everybody, there's such good comments coming from the chat, and your presentation has been greatly enjoyed. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll be able to stay and contribute further to the discussion. Right now we're going to take a break. It's 11:25, and I just need to check on my program that we are a few minutes behind. Can we let us take our, can I be advised by the team? Do we come back in 10 minutes? Would that be in order? We need that break. I think we'll have to come back in 10 minutes and catch up.
I agree, Jean. I agree, Judith. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And Tandy, as chair of the next session, I hope that's all right with you. Okay, so we will be back in 10 minutes time. Thanks very much.
Hey, I think we are back in action. So welcome back, everybody. My name is Tandy Henkeman, and I am the project administrator and manager for the IDEA Research Unit. It is a great pleasure to our next panel discussion on in-service training. And on the panel, we have some esteemed guests. We have Mr. Jabulani Ngobo, who is from the Department of Basic Education and Training. We have Mr. Theo Tulu, who is from the South African Council for Educators, SACE. We have Ms. Berenice Daniels, who is the Director of Inclusive and Specialized Education Support.
I've got a class. I've got to be seated for this. You can go to my office. Thank you. Yeah. And please remind me to sign in.
Sorry about that. So we have Ms. Berenice Daniels, as I mentioned, who is the Director of Inclusive and Specialized Education and Support. We have Ms. Marie Skuman, who is the Global Technical Lead for Inclusive Education at Leonard Cheshire. And last but not least, Ms. Haneli Swanepoel, who is from Down Syndrome, South Africa. So I'm going to ask our panelists, please just to briefly provide an overview of your role within disability inclusion and education and the priorities that frame your work. If it's okay, can we start with Ms. Haneli Swanepoel?
Morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Firstly, I'm part of the Down Syndrome Association of South Africa. I'm also a mother of a child with Down syndrome. And we started long ago, long before White Paper 6, we already started with the advocacy of change, for change and inclusive education. And I'm also a teacher, and I am the one that are supposed to implement all these wonderful policies, in short.
Thank you so much, Haneli. Marie, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be invited to participate in this panel. This is close to my heart. I'm wearing many hats today. I work for Leonard Cheshire, as you said, as a global technical lead in inclusive education, working across several countries in Africa and Asia. We reach out to about 38,000 children with disabilities, all in mainstream education and all in low-income contexts. But I'm also a mother of a son with Down syndrome and honorary board member of Down Syndrome South Africa, as well as a technical advisor to the Catalyst for Inclusive Education of Inclusion International. And as Hanli has already said, I think parents with children with disabilities have long ago been at the forefront of campaigning for inclusion, and because it's so central to our own lives. But I worked for the Ministry of Education for nearly more than 20 years, working on all the policies that have been discussed today, and I have a real interest to see how the policies can be expanded, improved, and how through teacher education we can explore new models. And so today, in what I have to contribute is to also share some of the ideas that we've tried across the globe in much less resourced context than we have in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Thank you. I'm going to ask that the panelists can all place their videos on as well. It'd be nice to put a name to a face. Berenice, do you mind introducing yourself briefly?
Thank you, Thandi. Very pleased to be on your panel today. So I have a long history of being involved in this field, and together with Maurice Kuman, who's also on the panel, was part of the national commissions that looked into the sector, and whose work eventually led to the development of White Paper 6, crafting a policy for the country in the new democratic South Africa. And then subsequent to that, I was at the helm of a district responsible for inclusive education and specialized support, and that was one of the nodal districts that was involved in the field testing of the recommendations in White Paper 6. So taking policy into practice and all the challenges and opportunities that entailed. Currently, I'm at the Provincial Department of Education in the Western Cape, responsible for inclusive and specialized education support. Our focus is on making sure that every child gets the optimal education. So every child matters, but also every teacher matters. And eventually that would help to create this inclusive society. I think that just to say my connection with TEDI, we've been involved in developing the programs, contributing in various ways, presenting, and also with Teaching for All, in piloting an in-service version of the pre-service Teaching for All modules. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berenice. And again, to the panelists, if I can ask that you place your video on, that will be wonderful. Thank you so much. Jabulani, speak to us.
Thank you very much, Thandi. And my name is Jabulani Ngobo, and I'm not new in inclusive education. Although I took a break in terms of not a break in terms of the heart, but a break in terms of what I was doing at the time. But I think I was involved. I think in the initial stages of the white paper, and I make reference to Maurice Kuman, and I think of those years with Professor Muthu Krishna and Berenice as well. So it's been quite a journey, and I'm a teacher by profession, and went through the ranks as deputy principal of a school. And I spent some time working with the portfolio committee on basic education. And thereafter, I joined the Department of Basic Education. My current position at the Department of Basic Education is Director for Inclusive Education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jabulani. And Theo, please kindly introduce yourself. Mr. Tulu? I don't think Mr. Tulu has joined us as yet. So as soon as he does join, I'll ask him to introduce himself. But I think maybe.
Oh. Are you referring to me? Good morning.
Yes, Mr. Tulu.
How are you?
Very well, and yourself?
I've been part of the webinar, so maybe I'm speaking from a distance. I will be using another laptop in 2 minutes, and then you'll be able to see me. Thank you.
No problem, sir. Mr. Tulu?
Yes, ma'am.
Would you like to briefly just introduce yourself to the audience and our attendees?
Oh, okay. My name is Teacher Tolo. I work for the South African Council for Educators. I have been with the council for more than 10 years. We are dealing with professional development of teachers, but broadly, the SACE mandate cuts across the legal and ethics, registration of teachers, teacher professionalization. So we have so many arms that we have to deal with in terms of the SACE Act. So I will share with the colleagues in terms of the mandate that we have and the direction that we want to take and our role in terms of teacher education.
Thank you, Mr. Tulu. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure having you part of this discussion. So as mentioned before, our discussion will revolve around in-service training of our educators. And I have just a few questions that I'll be addressing to certain panelists, but of course, hoping that it will be an interactive discussion as well. So the first question I have is to Jabulani and Berenice. So research and data from provinces attest to the need for teachers who are competent and skilled to ensure that children with disabilities could be included and participate in learning in mainstream schools. Both the DBE and the Provincial Department of Education are responsive to this by offering training to in-service teachers. However, I think we can agree that the question to be answered is on the impact of such training in a classroom and the increased enrollment of children with disabilities in their local neighborhood schools. Can you perhaps describe some measures taken to firstly measure the impact and secondly the results of any interventions that have been made?
Tani, I think let me allow Berenice to respond first because she's at the province, and then I'll come late.
Thank you, Jabulani.
Thank you, Thandi. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of the Western Cape province, just to tell you what we've done. So there's a lot of inherited expertise in our special schools, and although due to natural attrition we're losing a lot of that valuable resource, but through TEDI now we're building that up again. So what we have done is to take the support to the learner rather than the learner to the support, and our focus has been on building capacity throughout the system. So we're doing in-service training of teachers. We're doing in-service training of practitioners. We have these transversal outreach teams that are based at our special schools, which we are incrementally converting into special school resource centers. So we're doing a lot of that at the moment. We sit with a backlog, because as you know, the pre-service training of teachers often hasn't included sufficient training in inclusive education and including particularly children with disabilities. Mm-hmm. I also want to just make mention of the fact that we have a partnership with the British Council in the Teaching for All training, and I've mentioned that we have partnered with them in seeing how the pre-service training can become available to our in-service teachers. What has been the response? The teachers who have been through the training have said, you know, this is really what we've needed for a long time, and they say every teacher needs this, which is so gratifying to hear. I think that they do, however, mention challenges that they find in their classrooms, large classes, children who come into the education system with backlogs. There's very unequal provision at preschool level. Sometimes not enough intervention by our sister departments in health and social development. So I think that there's a huge need, and I think that we are trying to the best of our ability, using our own expertise as well as expertise from NGOs, from other organizations to provide such in-service training. And also not to underestimate the natural experience that teachers develop just working in a diverse classroom. You know, so we also need to develop that confidence in teachers. How is that impacted training in the classroom? How is it impacted in the classroom? Our reports are that there are fewer learners being referred. Still too many, I might add, but fewer learners. So our teams go into the schools and provide this capacity building, sit on school-based support teams, and in that way, you know, just build up the ability of teachers to respond. So I think we're beginning to see a shift, and I'm very hopeful that once we take to scale teaching for all in TEDI courses, you know, that we're going to see a big turnaround. Thanks, Thandi.
Thank you so much, Berenice. Jabulani, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thank you very much. I think one of the indicators for me of some progress that we are making, although there are still challenges, is that we have seen an increase in the number of learners that are within the system, and we've seen that there are more and more learners who are going through the system. Although there are still challenges with regards to learners that are out of school, but I think the work around ensuring that all learners are ultimately within the system is happening. It may not be happening in the pace that we would love to see, but it is happening. But also as part of how we are monitored by Parliament. For instance, with regards to inclusive education, we have 5 indicators in our annual performance plan for this current financial year, which is looking at how we are doing in various areas of priority in respect of the implementation of White Paper 6. But also, I think as part of the process of the White Paper on the rights of people with disabilities, we are part of that in other words, we are part of the matrix that monitors that's led by DSD. I think in terms of how we see progress in that regard is that we've made significant progress. Yes, there are challenges here and there, but I think it provides a good tool for us to begin to see what is the impact of some of the initiatives that we've put in place. But also we make contributions to the country reports, the UN country reports. We did so in 2018. Now we are going to be doing so in 2022 as well, to kind of gauge our performance in respect of the observations that the committee the committee makes. So what happens is that once we have those observations, then we start implementing them and using them as our target in terms of what it is that we want to achieve. So for me, what we also have done is that I think previously the focus of our efforts have been training. But now what we've done, if you look at how we've coined our indicators, is that we have begun to monitor implementation to kind of see if there is any movement with regards to how the policy priorities are being implemented. So I think it ties in well with what Berenice is saying. You will see that maybe when we speak to the specific interventions, that some of the interventions have just started in terms of with regards to specialized training. But these are, as we see, there is a take-up, and we're hoping that there's going to be positive results. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Ngobo. I see Mr. Nkosinathi Duma, you had your hand raised. I'm not sure if you still have a question before I ask the panelists for their response.
Yes, Tandy, I do have a question. I wanted to find out if Berenice and Mapolova Berenice and Jabulani will take follow-up questions. Just for clarification purposes, Berenice, you talking about the in-service training. What is the basic content of that training? Is it about a curriculum or is it about the methodology?
You're still on mute, Berenice.
Apologies. We have a wide range of in-service training opportunities that we present. So it's both on curriculum differentiation, adaptation. It might be disability specific. So on South African Sign Language, on autism spectrum disorder. So there's quite a wide range of interventions we do. Yeah.
Berenice, Dr. Ngob, Mapolova, how are you?
I am good. Yes, I am good.
Thank you very much.
Muted, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm saying when I'm moving around, the schools got the qualification full service schools. Can you just give me an explanation? What are these schools and for the qualification full service schools? Do you have anything about that? Thank you, sir.
The full service schools are in white paper 6. In white paper 6, designs or reorganizes support into 3 different support regimes. One, you will have support that is provided by a public ordinary school, where you will have low level of support. In other words, the policy level, the policy minimums as the level that is at the level of the policy minimum at a public ordinary school. But you will have the moderate support, and moderate support that responds to those learners who have needs that can't be met in a public ordinary school. They must then be the full service schools will then accommodate those learners and provide services for those learners. Then at your highest level, then you will have special schools where you have where learners should receive specialized support that's for high intense needs. So it's actually a concept that comes from white paper 6 in terms of how support has been redesigned and reorganized. So it's just that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ngobo. Thank you, Tandy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nkosinathi. I would really like to encourage our delegates to please ensure that this is an interactive discussion. Our panelists are here to take your questions. So please feel free to raise your hand or post your questions in the chat. If you have any questions, and I'm going to ask our panelists just to keep their eyes on the chat as well, if there are questions that you can possibly answer. Okay, so thank you so much, Jabulani and Berenice, for your answers. I'm not sure if there's any response from the rest of our panelists, Maria, Handley, or Mr. Tulu, if you have any response to that.
I would like to. I don't know if it's Handley or me first.
You can go for it, Marie. Go for it.
Okay. You know, I wanted to, now that I'm looking into our system from a more global perspective, and having been part of so many global discussions through the World Bank, and this year with the release of the GEM report and with his background paper on on the rights of persons with disabilities in inclusive education, I've become aware that we've become stuck in our own discourse in South Africa. We're spending very little time as a nation speaking about the huge problem for us of continuing to run parallel systems, continuing to build more special schools in direct conflict with our obligations in terms of the convention that we were one of the first countries to ratify, and which was further even emphasized in the general comment number 4, which promotes the zero reject principle. And I think that perhaps inherent to the fact that we are running these parallel systems is that we are not really looking at a completely new funding system or funding norms, which transfers funding to support the mainstream and support also teacher training in the mainstream. Still too much money is directed to the segregated part of the system. I looked this morning at the EMIS results or EMIS data that's posted on the website of the DBE. And I'm actually shocked to see that there are no data in any of the publications, EMIS publications, tracking how many children with disabilities in ordinary schools, what's the increase of enrollment of children with disabilities in ordinary schools, and if reports are done to Parliament to show how well we've done, we mostly report on how many children are in special schools, what was the increase. We're looking at 119,000 children roughly, that was the 2016 results, of children with disabilities, and we obviously know that there must be hundreds of thousands more children in the mainstream or just not accounted for. So I think that for me and many speakers, and especially I was so impressed with Professor Diali that said that all teachers must have the training. But an argument that's coming up very often in the discourses that we have is we can't allow the children to be enrolled before the teachers have been trained. And I have great respect for what Berenice is saying, that the Western Cape has been really incremental, has done this in a very systematic way to make sure that they have solid training. But we know of the inequality between provinces. We know that in the Eastern Cape, in provinces like the Northern Cape, there are vast tracts of those provinces where children don't have access to special schools. So if all the funding in that province is going into special schools, it must leave so many other children in mainstream schools or out of school. So I do think that we need to have really, as a part of our drive towards equality and equitable distribution of resources, have more scope for giving support. And I was listening a lot to the speakers from the new specialization courses, the universities that offer that. And also they are training cohorts of newly specialized people. Are they training them to go and work in special schools? Or is there anything that we can do to change the system to make these people with specialized training part of a cohort, a small army of itinerant teachers? If you just look at the money that is being spent on segregation in South Africa, how much better can we spend that money by using the specialists that now come trained out of these specialization courses to support teachers on an ongoing? And I always like to refer back to Gordon Porter, who was my mentor from New Brunswick, you know, and how successfully they were. They had a much more political decision to move from segregation to mainstreaming, and they used the existing resources to support school teachers and so on. And many people said school teachers have much more to offer than they are made to believe. And I think that you must leave your specialists to give this backup support, to give ongoing training. Our DBSTs are not supposed to be running the special schools and see what their quality is, but to make sure that they track learners. And I think we should stop also speaking about the 3 types of schools and 3 levels of ability, because that's actually not really in line with the international obligations that we've made. And therefore, I do think also that I know that the National Department has made a commitment to UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and curriculum differentiation to become systemic, but I'm not sure to what extent is it managed, monitored, and to what extent is the impact of that in the classroom actually monitored. Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to go on.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marie. Thank you for that. And Hanali, I know that you wanted to respond as well. I see that Prof. Diali has her hand raised as well. So Hanali, if I can ask if you just briefly respond, and then we can see to those raised hands.
Yes, thank you. I just want to respond to what Marie said and the previous speaker also said. It is very important. Our parents still struggle to get their children in school. And as an association, the Down Syndrome Association, we really have to battle to get our children still in. So, and now I'm talking about mainstream schools, our ordinary schools. I'm not talking about special schools. And if we talk inclusive education, we really have to, because we are mainly focusing on Gauteng, the province, and we've done a lot of work in the Pretoria, Centurion area. But if you go beyond the borders, I can promise you it's a total different story to get these learners into schools. And if you contact them, the DBST as a help, it's really a teething process, I can almost say, to get the child in and then sustain that support, because teachers leave, you know, you empower the school, but then the principal leave, that's the head of this process, or the very good teachers leaving, and then what is happening next. So I am very so that the whole school needs to be empowered and not only a teacher at a time. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Hanli, thank you so much for your comment. Thank you for your response. Prof. Diali, I'll take your comment, and then Mr. Tulo, I see that you also have your hand raised. So Prof, please speak to us.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I do agree with Mary with her comments. I just want to clarify the one aspect that I might not have been clear in terms of the training of the teachers in higher education in terms of our program. At undergrad level, Mary, what we do, those are trained as full teachers who can teach in any school. They're actually trained as senior and FET teachers, or as foundation or intermediate teachers. However, we include this particular so that they are able to also take care of children with special needs. So when I spoke about them doing their will is done both in the current streaming in terms of the public mainstream schools and special schools, so that they've got a full understanding of what's happening in both contexts. Because we find that teachers are trained in mainstream and they get a post in a special school, which is the reality of what's happening now, and they don't have a clue of what's happening, or even the other way around. They are in mainstream schools and they don't know how to deal with these learners who've got special educational needs. So it is not an exclusive training that they are going to qualify to only teach in special schools, but they are foundation, intermediate, senior, and FET teachers who specialize in this particular module on neurodevelopment.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. I appreciate that. I appreciate it. And although our discussion is around in-service training, I think it's important to note what training exists at a higher educational institute level. So thank you so much for raising that. Mr. Tulu, you would like to add?
Yes, Tandi, I would like to make some comments regarding this. Well, for me, from a corner of observation, I don't think the department is handling inclusive education in the manner that White Paper 6 has had envisaged. Because you look at the structure within the districts, within the province, you would find in one province there's one subject advisor that must support inclusive education schools, if you look at it that way. And the question is, why are we looking at inclusive education as an orphan? Because for me, let's take Free State as an example. There's a parent who struggled to find school for an autistic child in the Free State. They ended up enrolling the child in Marty Duplessis School, which is not necessarily
intended for this type of a learner. So you have that in the system, and you look at the spread of those that must support schools. Do they know what they are doing? Are they vested with the necessary knowledge to support schools? Because sometimes we look at this from one angle of saying we'll move the differently abled learners in our schools. But what happens? You look at what the CS is saying. CS is saying we must form SBSTs. How functional are most of the SBSTs? Are they able to look at this and be able to refer where they must in terms of what they are picking up in the schools? So generally in the system, let's take White Paper 6 is a 2001 paper. When did we bring CS? Many years down the line, then we had CS. So what have you been doing in terms of implementing White Paper 6? Because the intention is for us to have an inclusive system. And I like what Mari is saying, to say when we go to a district, you'll find that there's a small cluster, and inclusive education is their responsibility as a small cluster. It is not what we perceive to be an all-inclusive exercise where everyone in all subjects must be dealing with inclusive education. Thanks, Tata.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Thea. I appreciate your comment. I'm just very conscious of time. We were thankfully given an extra 10 minutes, which gives us just under a half an hour to carry on with the discussion. And I do have a few more questions, but just to note some comments in the chat. A lot of delegates agreeing with Marie and Hanali, Mr. Tolu, thank you so much again. Noting, I just want to read one particular comment. That one person said, I agree with Schoeman, we are still running parallel systems. The same applies with the interventions that are in silos. So quite a few very interesting comments, and again, I'd ask the panelists just to keep your eye out for the chat group. I'm going to ask, before we briefly move on to our next question, if Jabulani and Berenice, if you have any follow-up response to that.
Yes, if I could come in, the issue around the dual system is a real challenge. So it's an issue that we have flagged. You remember that the white paper is reaching its 20 years of implementation in next year, and this has been one of the challenges. And I think what Marie is raising is an issue that we are quite conscious of. Is the issue that the way in which the provisioning or the service provisioning is happening is forcing the system to maintain the dual system of special education and mainstream education. And I think it's an issue that we need to look at. What we have therefore done in preparation for the fact that the white paper is reaching its 20 years next year, there is a process that we are initiating to actually review the white paper, to reflect on what are some of these things that are causing these things, and what is it that needs to happen, and with regards to how these challenges should be dealt with. The issue around what Mr. Tulo is raising is an issue that is tied to what Marie is saying. That the more you provide to the special schools part, the more you disregard the public ordinary school. So it's an issue that requires like a radical shift in how we look at inclusive education. But also I think the issue around the fact that an inclusive education section, if you like, could be responsible for everything that has to do with inclusive education is an issue that we need to look at, because it defies the the intention of building an inclusive education and training system. So in other words, the challenge is that how do you then deal with the issue of making sure that whatever you are doing is across the system. In other words, the question that we've been asking is that we have seen that there is not much that is happening, although significant work has happened in terms of the structures, the awareness and the referrals and the training in the public ordinary schools. But still in the public ordinary schools, there is a lot more work to be done. And I think the issue around the struggles around the admission of learners in public ordinary schools is tied to that. But I think it may be ambitious to think that we were not going to have these challenges by this time. So my sense is that these are the things that we need to reflect on and see what it is that we can do after this 20-year period to make sure that maybe towards 2030 we have dealt with these deficiencies. So for me, I accept and support the issues around the challenges that have been raised. And I have indicated that we have as a country achieved quite a lot, and I think that's why we can talk about SEAS and all this, but these are issues that are tied to the history of our country that we need to deal with in terms of that. One of these being a dual system that we had even before the white paper 6, and how we deal with it to make sure that we have one education system. I think these you will see the challenges of a dual system were exacerbated more by COVID-19, where you had difficulties in continuing the services due to the fact due to the design of the system that encourages a dual system. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jabulani. And we're going to speak very briefly around COVID and the challenges it presented as well. But before I move on to my next question, just one comment to read. One delegate mentioned that once again, teacher empowerment is critical. Teachers need to take agency and responsibility for inclusion, but they firstly need to be supported, and secondly, there needs to be courses and programs that they can choose from that are tailored for their needs as well. Okay. There are so many wonderful comments coming through, and I hope that you are seeing these wonderful comments and questions as well. But let's move on to the next question that I have, and this is primarily for Marie and possibly Haneli as well. Just a question on the increased interventions in South Africa to strengthen disability inclusion in education. Can you give us insight on what guidance is available in terms of global trends and best practice that we can offer to our stakeholders?
Okay, let me just make sure I've got my sound on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.